Welcome to the program. My guest is Dahlia Lithwick. She is a contributing editor at Slate Magazine. You can read her work online at slate.com. It is so good to see you.
It's so good to be here.
All right, here's my question to start this. All the years that you have covered the United States Supreme Court and judicial issues in America, have you ever seen an 8-member Supreme Court? Have you ever seen a court this locked down into the politics of the day, of the kind of court that we are witnessing now?
No, I mean, I've covered Bush v. Gore, and I covered, both Obamacare challenges. I've seen, last summer when the court handed down the gay marriage case, and we spoke right after that, you and I, and it was crazy there, and this is like exponentially crazier. And it's crazy in all the ways that are so hard to convey, because it's the craziness of nothing happening. You know what I mean? This isn't, this is a 4-4 court. This is a court that does not think it's going to get a 9th justice, possibly for a year and a half. It's a court that is not docketing cases for next term. They're just not taking cases. It's a court that's kicking back huge big ticket appeals to the lower courts and saying, good luck with this, work it out. And it's not functioning. But it's not a story, because a court not functioning isn't as interesting as a 5-4 court screaming at each other.
With some major decision, yeah. So they're not. So there are no major decisions. They're not doing anything.
Well, there are a few more teed up, but the ones that we've seen come down already. I mean, if you had asked me February 12th, before Justice Scalia died, I would have said, Coy, this is the term of our lifetimes. Forget Obamacare, forget Obergefell, the marriage case. This term had everything on it. We have affirmative action. We have Obama's immigration initiatives. We have a major abortion case, probably the biggest one the court has heard in decades, a major contraception case that's as big as Hobby Lobby was 2 years ago. This was a case, a term for the ages. And now it's just fizzle, plop, nothing doing. And it's an amazing thing to see the court functionally unable to do its job.
Well, then explain what we've heard from the Republicans who said, we're not going to let this president. We're not going to let this president do what is his constitutional duty and our constitutional duty to replace this seat on the Supreme Court. We're not going to do it, and the court will be fine. You won't notice it. It'll operate just like it operates. That's what we were told, that it's not a big deal. But you watch the court. Is it a big deal?
I mean, it depends on what you think the court is there to do. If you think that the best court does nothing, then this is the best term ever, right? You're getting a bunch of 4-4 deadlocks. You're getting a bunch of, really, you could style them differently, but they're all punts. Efforts to kick the can down the road and say to the litigants, come back to us in 3 years when we're fully staffed. And so they're artful punts, and you can say, oh, it's a jurisdictional question, or you can say, send it back to the lower courts and let them look at it again, but they're all punts. If you believe that the Supreme Court has a decision-making function, that at the end of the line, when you have jurisdictions that have differing law, and these cases need to be reconciled, the court's not doing that. It's not doing its primary function of making one coherent set of laws across the country. And so certainly you can say, is the air conditioning on? Are the lights on? Are justices putting on robes? Yeah. It looks like it's working, but the truth is this is nothing we've ever seen, at least in my lifetime, where we have the possibility of a 1.5 year, a 2-year vacancy, and a court that's more or less saying, we're not even taking cases next term. They've taken a handful of cases, and they're boring cases because they know they can't deal with the hard cases. It just seems to me that's not what a court's meant to do.
So, Dahlia, we didn't have to be here. The president did nominate someone who even conservatives said he's qualified. What happened with Merrick Garland? Where is that?
Well, I think, probably the first hint was that within, 2 hours of Justice Scalia's death, we were getting Mitch McConnell and other folks tweeting out, we're not having a hearing for anybody. Antonin Scalia's son could be named, Eugene Scalia. We're not giving him a hearing. Nobody gets a hearing. And so we knew, right, we had fair notice long before Merrick Garland was nominated that Senate Republicans were simply not going to afford a hearing, a vote, no advise, no consent.
Right.
This is not the real president. And, the arguments that this is a lame duck president because it's February, and the election is in November, I mean, that was the party line. Now, this is unprecedented. We've certainly seen judicial obstruction. We've seen it on both sides. Everybody famously goes back to the Bork hearings, right? Robert Bork was Bork, but Robert Bork got a hearing. He got a vote. And so what's interesting now is that this has sort of escalated to a point where I think there's a real possibility that if Hillary Clinton were to get elected next November, they still wouldn't give a vote to her nominee. Because if the name of the game is because we can, that doesn't change.
They've proven that they can.
That doesn't change. I mean,
and they've redefined what obstructionism looks like.
Right. Right.
For judicial nominations.
And this is where it is a little bit frustrating as somebody who thinks about these issues. The public doesn't much care. This is a process problem. This is not Donald Trump. There's nobody talking about the size of their hands. This is just not exciting news. And so trying to communicate, there's been a huge effort in swing states, where Kelly Ayotte is in trouble, possibly over this. Senator Grassley himself is in a close fought race, So there's been an effort to say to people, make a noise, tell them to do their jobs. And almost no traction because it's so abstract. The idea that we should give a hearing to this guy, he's not that interesting, he's 62, he went to Harvard, I'm sorry, where is the, story here? And so it's been, I think, really a huge effort that the White House has made to try to gin up real outrage. But I think in a season where there are so many outrages that are more pressing and
this
more
one struggles
salient,
to get on the list, yeah.
Nobody cares.
And that's got to be so frustrating for you and for other people who cover the court. It's because you go and you watch the court and you see it's not working. It's understaffed. They're not able to do their constitutional duty. It doesn't work.
It's frustrating at two levels. One is, the sort of the contagion of the nihilism about government, right? I mean, we have a broken Congress saying that the president isn't the real president. And there's sort of only one branch of government left to go after, and it's the judicial branch. And the sort of the sensibility of, government is broken, you don't need government anyway, it all sucks, let's break the court too, is very hard to watch because the court doesn't have the powers that the other two branches have. The court has only public legitimacy to support it. But I think the other reason it's very, very frustrating, at least to me, is because this is really not something that the justices themselves can talk about. And so what you hear right now in this climate of, almost complete paralysis and dysfunction, the only person who can say it out loud is John Paul Stevens, retired Justice John Paul Stevens. Because the sitting justices, for all sorts of complicated reasons, can't say the partisan sentence, give us a ninth justice.
They can't hold a press conference and say, we're understaffed, we can't do our job.
Nope.
Come on, Congress, do your duty.
Justice Stephen Breyer, last week, Justice Stephen Breyer, because it's so important to say we transcend politics, right? Their cardinal core belief, which is half right and half wrong, is that they are a completely apolitical institution and they can do their job with 8 justices or 6 or 4, doesn't matter because they're a court. They're this oracular court. And no less a brilliant thinker than Stephen Breyer last week said in a speech we don't decide that many cases 5-4. 20% of the cases, so what if they're the most important consequential case? We can do it with 8 people. And this is, interestingly, 2 days later, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was like, he's lying. That's not true. This is really hard. But I think it's institutionally doesn't have the capacity to say, help us. It doesn't have the capacity to say we're paralyzed.
So what does Judge Stevens say then? Justice Stevens?
Justice Stevens has been out saying this is, impossible. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, right after Justice Scalia died, was at pains to say, of course they need 9 justices. It needs to be fully functioning. It has to have. So they've been able to go out and say this doesn't work because they're retired. But the fact of the matter is, there isn't an advocate for the court. And insofar as there is one, it's the president. And given that he's the original sin as far as Senate Republicans are concerned,
he's not a solution.
He's not the spokesman for this. And so then, you have these poor Supreme Court reporters. Tuesday, I trudged in. Instead of handing down 4 cases, they handed down 1. They accepted one new case for the fall where they would ordinarily accept many more. The case was about peat farmers. The Chief Justice's opinion was about all the myriad uses of peat. You could use it for whiskey. You could use it for golf courses. I was like, oh my God, this is not what we're reduced to. Peat jokes.
Yeah.
But I think it's
Meanwhile, you have laws in the country, as you say, in different districts and states that are in conflict.
Sure, and we have a bunch of appeals that came up. I mean, again, this is so important. If you think about the court as it was constituted in October of 2015, when the term started, there were a bunch of unbelievable appeals that would have forever changed the principle of one person, one vote, that were attempting to do away with the funding system we have for public sector unions in this country. I mean, these were big, big cases. They were going to reach out and ask the Supreme Court to really fundamentally shift doctrine in one area of the law and another. Those things are still on the docket.
They're sitting there.
Someone's got to resolve it.
In this term?
Well, I mean,
or can they just punt it to the next term?
They'll punt. I mean, certainly in the cases that we've seen so far, that public sector unions case, the court came down 4-4. What that means is that the lower court opinion stands, but that the law is different in different jurisdictions. The abortion case, the big abortion case, that's HB2, the Texas abortion restrictions, may very well come down 4-4, in which case the law in the Fifth Circuit will be different from the law in the Ninth Circuit. And we'll just wait for a couple of years.
And Bob McDonnell's appeal, former Virginia governor, convicted on corruption charges, he's also appealed to the Supreme Court in this term.
That's right. It was the last case that was argued in April. And, ordinarily I would say that looks like it was going to be another 4-4, although I think the court really was sympathetic to his arguments and the arguments put forth by his lawyers. So that might be one that actually comes out 6-3 or something else, but I think that may not be a 4-4.
So if they vote in his favor, what happens? Do they then say he shouldn't have been convicted at all and he doesn't have to go to jail? And does that apply to his wife, the former First Lady of Virginia, Maureen McDonnell?
They can decide it as broadly or as narrowly as they want. They can say, we're going to send it back to the lower court. The jury instructions were wrong, about what public corruption means. So we want to have it go to another trial with proper jury instructions. They can do that. They're probably not going to make a huge sweeping ruling about the nature of the Hobbs Act and the laws under which he was convicted, because it's just unnecessary. So the other thing that we're seeing that's happening over and over again this term is that one way to punt a case is to decide almost nothing. Decide sort of a Bush v. Gore sort of ruling that's like, it's only good for this set of facts. And that's the other thing that the court needs to do, is provide guidance to the lower courts. If a similar fact pattern comes up, then this is the law.
But they don't do that when they're so forced into saying, our decision, don't read into it anything other than it applies only to this specific case. That's not their job. Their job is to rule on the ideas in the case.
Right, and the most, I think, significant way in which we saw that was in Zubik, which was this sort of Little Sisters case. It was the follow-on to Hobby Lobby. It was the religious not-for-profits who were saying, we don't like the accommodation that the government's given us, and we won't give contraception to our workers. This is a case that came up from multiple federal appeals courts. The law across the nation is very different, and this is a core constitutional question about religious liberty and conflict with federal statutes. Literally, what the Supreme Court did was they asked the parties on both sides the week after argument. I've never seen this happen, Coy. They said, everybody, file some supplemental briefs. What do you think of this? They sort of became the special master. We're going to settle this right here. So the parties filed briefs. They disagreed fundamentally still. And the court literally handed down a ruling in Zubik that said, we think you guys are close. Work it out. That was literally, we're sending it back. We're vacating all of the lower court judgments. And we really feel bullish about the idea that judges below can fix this. I mean, it's less a Supreme Court than it is like, the guy who's like settling traffic tickets. Like, this is not giving guidance to anybody.
It's like calling on a fireman to come put the house on your fire, and he comes in, he stands, looks at your house burning, and says, I think you could figure this out.
Yeah, you can work it out.
There might be some water nearby. I'm going to go back to the fire station. And you just take care of this.
And if you think about when that decision came down, both sides proclaimed that they'd won. in part because they kind of had one, because nobody had lost. And it's just really, if you think,
amazing.
And I do think that these religious liberty claims, these are the cake bakers, they don't want to bake cakes, and these are, people all across the country who don't want to, hand out clerks, who don't want to hand out same-sex marriage licenses. This is the forefront legal issue, I think, of the coming era, for the court to just be like, we don't really need to make any law here today. Let's just hope they fix it. This is just, and you can't fault the court. You can't say they're abdicating
No, there's no better
responsibility.
illustration than the fact that this ideological debate and dynamic in Congress has broken the court.
Sure.
Successfully.
I think so. And
Yeah.
I think it goes to, and I guess this is where, welcome to my breakdown, but I think this is where it's so hard to explain in a nation that has so much mistrust of authority, that an institution of government needs to have some authority and needs to have the ability to work. Because I think the general response is good, because I didn't like Bush v. Gore. I didn't much like Citizens United. So maybe a hobbled court isn't the worst thing. And that's a really, I think, pernicious way to start thinking about our justice system.
Yeah. We're talking with Dahlia Lithwick. Let's take a very quick break, and when we get back, we'll talk about a certain New York real estate developer who is going to be a presidential candidate for the GOP. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Dahlia Lithwick of Slate Magazine. Dahlia, one word, Donald. How do you make sense of what we've seen happen over the last year in the campaign for the nomination for the GOP? I don't think anybody last summer of 2015 would have told you, oh, absolutely Donald Trump will win, unless you were Donald Trump.
Right.
It's certainly shocking. I don't hold my cards too close. I do not support him. I think he's dangerous. I think he's a demagogue, and I've said that on this program. What's your read on this, of what's happening?
In some sense, this is so outside my pay grade, because I don't cover politics, and I find...
But you have covered the conventions for many years.
I have. But it's because I work in this bubble of sort of civility and restraint, and it's funny, just
black robes.
Anecdotally, I wrote a piece a few weeks ago confessing that I've known Ted Cruz, of all people, since we were 19 years old. We were debate rivals all through college, and that the Ted Cruz that we saw in this campaign was nothing like the Ted Cruz, not just the Ted Cruz that I used to debate against, but more pointedly, I think, when he was Solicitor General for Texas, he would argue cases at the Supreme Court. He did a bunch of them. He was so good as an advocate, as an oral advocate. And my takeaway...
Well, I've been told he's just a phenomenal debater as well.
He was a phenomenal debater. I famously lost out Team of the Year to him, but I'm okay. I'm working through it. But I think it's to me it bespeaks so much about the difference between law and politics, that a person who I could barely listen to by the end of the campaign, because it was Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
And yet, if you had asked me 6-7 years ago who the best oral advocates I'd ever seen at the core was, and I don't agree with Ted's politics, by the way, but he was that good. And to me, really, it goes to the constraint of the legal system. You can't make stuff up. And if you make stuff up, you'll lose. And there are justices holding you to standards of decorum and protocol. And when you're up there, you become, no matter how polemical and what a demagogue you are, you have to play by the rules. And he played by the rules, and he was amazing.
You have to conform to a certain level of professionalism when you argue before the court that you don't have to adhere to when you're at a GOP debate for president.
Exactly, and so, which is a very circular way of saying that I can't fathom what made Trump happen. I, like you, spent the whole summer saying to my kids, like, this tops out at 12, this tops out at 40. Wait, he's gonna have a registry for Muslims. It's over tomorrow. I assure you, it's over tomorrow. At every turn, you would say this would be. Right? This is career ending. I mean, if you think that people's careers...
And his numbers only went up.
No, politicals' careers ended over legitimate rape, right? Binders full of women. And here's a guy who calls women pigs and dogs, and women are, I love him. So it's really hard to suss out what happened. I do think a big part of it is he came along at a moment where faith in government, faith in institutions is so depleted that someone who's able to say, I'm an outsider, experience doesn't work, so, let's have no experience.
And at a time, too, when both parties, including the one that's supposed to be the party of the people, and hasn't been since at least the 80s or 90s, both parties have turned their backs on the middle class and the working class and the poor. And you have huge swaths of millions of people who've been dispossessed by the political system, by the financial system, by the economy, and at a Bernie rally or at a Trump rally.
Right.
They're angry,
Right.
and they're smart enough to know I'm getting screwed.
Yeah.
And this whole system, which is supposed to serve the interests of my liberties, the interests of my well-being, it doesn't serve me anymore. It doesn't even care about me anymore.
Right. No, and I think, people, all rational people who say, the promise was if you worked hard, you did better than your parents, you put your kids into college, you bought a house. All of those promises have crumbled. We have not figured out, and this is, this shouldn't have been a surprise, how we were going to replace manufacturing jobs in this country. We just didn't figure it out. And so now we really have, a huge number of disgruntled voters who will, I think, vote for almost anyone that isn't out of the establishment.
Any semblance of an outsider,
Yep.
including a demagogue.
Yeah, well, including somebody who's sort of, self-proclaimed, like, weird, narcissistic, I just hate you today. I might not hate you tomorrow. There's this great story this week about how CNN, there's a chyron, is that what it's called, the little word that's under when he's talking, and it says, Trump says he never said this. He did, in brackets. And they're fact-checking him in real time on CNN, and it doesn't stick.
But people don't care.
No.
Supporters don't care. And the people who don't support him, it just, validates what they already know.
I think there was an interesting moment, and we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out, when he went after the press this week over the Trump University stuff, and really went after the Washington Post, went after ABC reporters by name, calling them sleazes, where he sort of, at a press conference with the press, started calling them out for really just doing their jobs, for just doing dutiful investigative journalism on his claims that he had given all these millions of dollars to veterans groups, and
which he hadn't.
He hadn't done. And let's wait and see if, journalists who had been, by and large, just taking dictation and, chortling for the last couple of months weren't a little bit dispirited to hear themselves called out for just doing their job.
Well, hopefully it'll shake them awake and they'll do the job they're supposed to do.
Query
Imagine
whether that
that.
happens, but I think that might have been, at least for the press, a moment at which, we're all, and he's talking sort of happily about doing away, changing libel laws as soon as he's president so you can sue newspapers more readily. You don't, by executive fiat, change libel laws, but, he really has no understanding of what an open, free press is. He thinks the press needs to praise him or be punished. And one hopes that reporters are going to start to realize, wow, this is not funny.
No, this is the kind of stuff you hear from a third world dictator.
Right.
It's the word I go back to. It's classic demagogue playbook.
Mm-hmm.
You bully people into either getting in line or shutting up.
Yep.
And that's what he does.
Yep.
What do you make of the Trump University case? Because he's not only gone after the reporters who've covered the story, he's gone after the judge in the case and called a native of Indiana, I think, a Mexican.
Right.
Because he doesn't like his name.
It's so crazy. In all my years of covering courts, to have a party to a dispute, not only go after the judge mid, trial, for doing nothing. What he did was release documents, which was perfectly
Happens all the time, yeah.
appropriate. But then to go further and say he's a hater and that he probably shouldn't be on the case because in Trump's original formulation he was Mexican, and then when Trump found out he's actually born in Indiana to parents who are of Mexican origin, and then the new iteration, which is, no, he has to be recused from my case because as a Mexican he is biased because of things I've said about building a wall. Like, that is crazy in like three-dimensional ways that I can't even wrap my head around. Really, your own hateful racist speech means that racial minorities are not suited to hear your case? I mean, even his defenders say this is like one bridge too far. You can't bump judges because of their racial and ethnic origins. But it just goes so deeply to this notion that anything that isn't for him, in his view, is inherently corrupt and suspect. It couldn't possibly be that a judge would legitimately think that these really grievous charges against him, which are, you know, as we're like poring over them, it's pretty awful what Trump University was perpetrating.
Looks like fraud to me.
It looks like just a grifter grifting, and you know, for the judge to be gone after. I mean, you can get sanctioned for talking that way about judges. You can be held in contempt for talking that way. To think that he's just going to have a judicial branch that's made up of like tiny little mini-me Trumps is, you know, and one of the things I will say that's so interesting about the way he thinks about judges is, you remember for, you know, months and months when establishment conservatives were trying to decide whether they could support him or not, and he was like, oh, who would I put on the Supreme Court? My sister, you know, was his answer. And she's a federal judge and pretty liberal and pro-choice. And he couldn't come up with a name, and then he finally 2 weeks ago produced a list of his judges. And even, you know, the most establishment conservatives are like, how would we trust this? He really just could put his sister up. I mean, there's no reason to believe just because he kind of coughed up a hairball after months of stalling and said, here's my list, that's his list.
We all know he would nominate his sister.
I would
Of course he would.
And Ivanka and his son. I mean,
And his daughter.
it's the Supreme Court.
It's a third world dictator. That's how he thinks.
Saying for months it's Miss Tennessee for the Scalia seat. So I've never. There's no consequence to these things for him, you know, and us sitting here and making fun of him just proves that we're haters.
Yeah. Dahlia, thank you so much for being here, and thank you even more for all the great work you do.
Thank you.
Dahlia Lithwick, she is at Slate Magazine. You can read her work online at slate.com. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find a complete archive of our conversations online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a great week, and y'all be good to each other.